Hello, everyone, and a good afternoon to you. Um, so, you may have noticed that I have an interest in the history of philosophy, and I have sought to introduce some of the questions which interest me in the form of paper presentations on my YouTube channel. Now, often it may appear that the contexts in which these questions become pertinent are distant or far removed, even if I try and make it relatable. And very many of us, including myself, for instance, if I were to be younger or less exposed to some of these texts, I would find myself distanced from the kind of questions which they raise because, in many ways, these texts are a part of a tradition of scholarship. A body of work responds to a prior proposition where it seeks to situate itself, perhaps posing a question, making an observation, or perhaps even an objection. Now, in terms of the kind of figure that this kind of reasoning best is exemplified in, it would be the newcomer, the child. And incidentally, the metaphor of the child is a very important figure in Nietzsche's work. And I suppose it's emblematic that very many people today, as in even historians of philosophy, identify in Nietzsche as a point where the history of philosophy can be divided effectively into what was earlier a quote unquote Neoplatonic era in the medieval period to what the postmoderns would today refer to as the genealogical method. Now, without getting into what precisely this schism may be, let me try and situate that moment itself, which is what the paper that I would like to present to you is in some ways about. A child in the glade beyond history, in Nietzsche's Metamorphoses of Spirit. Quote, "The child is innocence and forgetfulness, a new beginning, a sport, a self-propelling wheel, a first motion, a sacred yes." End of quote. In an early section of Friedrich Nietzsche's epic poem, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, there is a brief stanza where he most directly confronts the question which his work generically attempts to stray furthest away from: the question of change as manifested in spirit. For it is only in spirit and spirit alone that a metaphysics finds the body of its music. There is significant scholarship that suggests that Nietzsche was, in fact, the first, if not the most decisive break with the medieval tradition of Neoplatonic thought. And you may refer to Giles Fraser, 2008, Kuo Ping Claudie Tai in 2007 as references. A scriptural tradition deeply interwoven into Christianity and the early church. His position on such an institution is, I think, exemplified in the quotation, "There was only one Christian and he died on the cross." There have been more classically grounded thinkers like Heidegger who would like to portray the German philologist, Nietzsche, as the last Platonist, drawing from the psychoanalytic tradition to portray his severe break from the style of medieval scholasticism, while yet composing his magnum opus in aphorisms, stylistically parodying biblical verse, signifying to the post-structuralists the sublimation of the primordial Oedipal scene of the desire to kill the father. Locally, however, within the tapestry of German philosophy at the turn of the 19th century, and resting on the crest of the Prussian Empire, Hegelian dialectics found itself in that liminal space where it could claim to speak from a position that could justify history itself. The note of discord, however, even from the Judo-Christian milieu which Hegel spoke to, if not for, was that a justification of history smothers out the possibility of a redemptive hypothesis so close to the heart of Judo-Christianity. It is surprising then that we find in his greatest Is it surprising then that we find in his greatest student, Marx, an apotheosis to the redemptive hypothesis par excellence, a scientifically ingrained narrative of how class struggle would culminate in communism as the redemption of the entire history of oppression? The key to reading this curious constellation before us, I claim, lies in Nietzsche's Metamorphoses of Spirit from his masterpiece. It is here that he is nearest to the soul of his great enemy, Hegel, and we know the care with which Nietzsche picked his enemies. If the phenomenology of spirit is driven by the retroactive positing of a temporal differential immanent to perception itself, and culminating in the grandeur of the meaning of history, Nietzsche's style is broken, fundamentally. The garb of a narrative balms what the thrust of the painful reality of our narcissistic construction of the world often hides. The duplicities that a mind bears as a mantle ingrained into our very linguistic customs are themselves sliced open for examination in his mature works, such as Human, All Too Human. And of course, here we are referring to the genealogy of concepts and how certain modes of thought come to be accepted and the means via which they are transferred or passed through. Nietzsche was the man who stated that, quote, "It is my ambition to say in 10 sentences what others say in a whole book." End of quote. What gives credence to such bombastic propositions is the care with which Nietzsche unwraps our most earthly of follies, and the difficulty with which he struggles with what is perhaps the most dangerous of all realizations, that it is only language which enables us to lie. Here lies the core of his triad against the Platonic ideal of a truth or the idea of the good. For as I am sure you see now, one cannot go without the other. The ethics expounded from such a position, hence, cannot help but bear a resemblance with pre-Socratic Greek thought, a period which the philosophical novelist and author of the cult classic Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, Robert M. Pirsig, describes as the clearing upon which Western philosophy erected its first temples. A clearing, he claims, built upon the dust of the bones of the pre-Socratic philosophers. While there is no dearth of historical scholarship uncovering the rhetorical traditions of ancient Greek oratory, what I want to do today is highlight a certain truth that dawned upon both Hegel's most principled enemy, Nietzsche, and his greatest student, Marx. The imperative before us is the need to abandon history. How this is done is up for question. Whether it is done via a reappraisal of history itself, a reading which brushes it against the grain, if you will, as encountered in Marx's politico-historic works, such as the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, which famously begins with the pronouncement that, quote, "the history of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living," end of quote. Or can it be accomplished as an exodus, a move which refuses to even acknowledge what it leaves behind, in search only for an unrealized hypothesis. This is the question. Can metaphysics burn its historical bridges? The pyrotechnic child would say yes. Fundamentally, the creation of values needs to begin not upon the steps laid by predecessors, even if it is a critique of them, as such a critique would yet acknowledge the very history it condemns, hence positioning itself temporarily vis-a-vis the very nightmare it seeks to exit. The horizon of thought may be shattered, though it is yet to be remade. Here is where there is a genuine value in taking up Nietzsche's allegorical metaphor of the child. The child is unique among the various metamorphoses of spirit. Unlike the camel, the first bearer of burdens, the lion, the destroyer of the table of values, and the dragon, the last master who embodies all the values in history. The child is unchained from the spurs of the past and is directed not by the force of their negation, which the genre of critique is yet tied to, and from where it derives its narratorial force, but from a sacred yes, authorizing it to will its own world, a horizon which it wills to win. Who does this answer come from? And what is the question? Are perhaps the last true remnants of the history of metaphysics. Milan Kundera, a lifelong political exile and acclaimed novelist, once wrote, "The history of man, the struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting." The unsaid of such a proposition and its vanishing truth is that the only thing that makes a struggle worth our effort is precisely what was unforgettable. Kundera's laconic style skirts around the irony of such a paradox. Nietzsche was too honest for such a style, which is why he attacked the sacred. Now, this is the paper presentation that I wanted to lay before you. And of course, I take a small dig at Nietzsche at the end, who is, of course, acclaimed as perhaps the greatest modern rhetorical stylician in the history of philosophy. Now, as always, I will leave a link to the original text of this paper, and I welcome your comments, questions, criticism as always. And yeah, see you again and have a lovely afternoon. Bye bye.